In this video, we're going to talk about some different names for those black keys. Now, in a previous video, we talked about half steps and how you go from one note right to the next one is called a half step. Well, in this video, I want to introduce you to the idea of going down a half step. So you can go from C down to B, from B to that note right below it, from that on down, and so on. So every time you go up or down one key, you're going up or down one half step. So it works in both directions. And the reason this is important to realize is because if we look at all of our notes, and if we're going up a half step from a white key to a black key, well, we learned in a previous video that in this example A, going up from A to the next black key right above it would be an A sharp. Something though that might be a little tricky is that if we go down a half step from A, that turns into an A flat. And it goes on like this for the rest of these white keys here. So if we start at B and go down a half step, that black key becomes B flat. If we go to D and go down a half step, that black key becomes D flat. If we start at E and go down a half step, that black key becomes E flat. And then for G, same thing, you go down a half step and that black key becomes G flat. And then it just repeats itself. We would have A repeating itself again, go down a half step, and that becomes A flat. So this might become a little confusing, right? Because if we start at B and go down a half step, that's B flat. But if we start at A and go up a half step, that same black key is A sharp. And that's just the nature of it, is that these black keys can have two different names depending on what's going on in the music. Now, don't worry too much about this and don't get stressed. I just want to introduce you to the idea that if you start at a white key and you go up a half step, that is a sharp. And if you start at a white key and go down a half step, then it becomes flat. Now let's just go through the rest of these really quick. D flat can also be called C sharp. E flat can also be called D sharp. G flat can also be F sharp, and A flat can also be G sharp. And we're going to go over this a lot more in future videos, and it's going to be much clearer once we get through the course why these have two different naming conventions. I just want to again introduce you to the idea that a black key could be a sharp or a flat. It just depends on if you go up or down. And one way that might help you remember this is if you think of a line, if it's just a straight line, if you were to push it up, that would make it sharp. You know, it's got a little point to it, and that would make it a little sharper. If you were to then take that and push it down, well, then that would flatten it back out. So maybe that helps, maybe not, but I just like the idea that sharp things are pointy, right? And if you're holding a sharp object, that is pointing up. So that might help you remember that if you go up a half step, it turns into a sharp. And to flatten things out, you smash them down. So going down a half step will get you a flat. So let's try a quick quiz, shall we? If we are at F and we go up a half step, what would that be? If you said F sharp, then you're correct. Good job. All right, if we are at D and we go down a half step, what would that be? If you said D flat, good job. All right, if we are at G and we go down a half step, what is that black key? If you said G flat, you're right on. Good work. Okay, if we are at A and we go down a half step, what would that be? A flat. If we're at C and we go up a half step, what would that be? A C sharp. All right, and final one, if we're at G and we go up, what is that black key? If we go up a half step from G, it becomes G sharp. So let's now take a look at an example in some music of where you might see these symbols. I pulled some sheet music from a church book. It's called When I Am Baptized. And you'll notice that I've highlighted there, it's B and it's got that like a smaller B looking symbol next to it, and that's a flat. So if you were to look in sheet music or in Ultimate Guitar and you saw that symbol, that would mean that you're going to flatten that note. So that means we would go to B and go down a half step and we would find the flat. And we could then build our chord off of that key, the B flat. So hopefully that was helpful. Again, this was just a short introduction to flats. And we're going to talk a lot more about sharps and flats down the road. So don't stress too much about it. I just wanted to give you a preview so that when we go over these down the road, it's not totally confusing.